Welcome back to the Psalms, and today I'll be sharing the lessons that I've been reading Psalms 108 to 110. Psalm 108 is a psalm of David, praising God for assurance of victory over his enemies. He praised God with a steadfast heart and prayed for deliverance, knowing that ultimately only God could bring about the deliverance that he longed for. The first 5 verses are found in Psalm 57 and 60. The same verses. There overlaps with this psalm in those two psalms I just mentioned. The lands David mentioned in verses 7 to 9 all form a circle around Jerusalem, and David is indicating there that God owns all of that space. It all belongs to him, Jerusalem and all the surrounding lands. He expressed the feeling of abandonment by God in verse 10 to 11 and asked God for help and deliverance from all his enemies. In Psalm 109, we see David's plea to God for judgment over false accusers. I found it quite hard to read. I don't know about you. There were some very strong things that David spoke about his enemies, and I'm thinking, is this a person of God reading all these curses? But I guess we have to read this all in context to be able to understand. The things he said concerning his enemies must have come from a very painful place. He didn't hold back in explicitly expressing the ways he wanted God to deal with all his enemies. It's actually, to me, just revealed his humanity. No matter how holy or pious or whatever, when it comes down to it, we're all human. We all feel the sting of betrayal and pain and bitterness and all those kind of things. Although it may have come across as retaliation, David isn't doing that. Instead, he's calling upon God to act on his behalf, reflecting that his enemies were also God's enemies. So I think that's the way to look at it. That's the way I looked at it and saw it, from a different perspective. So he was saying, God do this, because that's what God will do to his enemies ultimately. And so David is saying, my enemies are your enemies, so treat them accordingly. God doesn't necessarily answer his requests, but we see that there's nothing wrong with expressing our innermost, our hurt and pains to God, just like David did. He receives the honest outpouring of our emotion, and he could, however, choose to act, but it won't, and even in this case, God could have chosen to act, but even if he did, it wouldn't be because of David, but he'll do it because of his namesake, because remember, David is his anointed, and those who curse and rebel against him are indirectly doing the same to God. So God's actions will be for him and not in response to David's curses for his enemies. Verse 8 was quoted by the disciples in Acts 1:20 when they sought to replace Judas. But in contrast to David's suffering for the sake of for the relationship with God, Jesus, who did so much more, taught his disciples to love their enemies instead of hating them and cursing them. So that's where we see the difference. So ultimately I was like, David's line isn't the line, that's not the road we should go down. You shouldn't go down the road of cursing and wishing bad because they are God's enemy. Jesus came and said, forgive instead. And I think that's, as Christians, that's what we should be holding on to. Psalm 110, this psalm points us to Jesus in a lot of ways. It's an announcement of the Messiah's reign and was used during the coronation ceremony of kings from David's line, emphasizing it as the lineage of Jesus. If you remember, the lineage, Judah and David's line was the line of the Messiah. It's split into two, a prophecy and a divine oath. It's quoted in 6 New Testament books. Jesus quoted verse 1 and says it's about him when he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. In Israel, the kings and priests were meant to do separate roles. So there was the role for example, David as the king, and then Nathan or whoever as the priest. But here we see that Jesus is both our high priest and our king. So he's the new order, of things, and that's the new order we should look forward to as Christians. So here's my hashtag getting to know God lesson for reading these Psalms. God is the only one we should set our hopes on. Psalm 108, 12 to 13 says, "Give us help from trouble, for the help of man is useless." So man can't help us, only God can. Only through God can we have victory. And God is the only one who works on our behalf. So looking for help from other people is futile. Let God be your helper today. Thank you for joining me in the Psalms. Tomorrow we'll be sharing lessons from 1 Chronicles 23 to 25. See you here. Have a good day. Bye.